the Mythology of Leadership. It is my pleasure to the next session. We haven't talked as much about leadership. It's a component within so many of the things we've talked about throughout the last 2 days, but to have a little stronger focus on what that looks like, I think is a great thing. So join me in welcoming the Executive Director of McChrystal Group Leadership Institute, Jeff Eggers, and the Director of Organizational Development, Leah Wohlfield.
Thank you.
Good morning. Okay, I know we thinned out a little bit, but can we have a little enthusiasm? Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. My name is Leah Wohlfield. I am the Director for Organizational Development at the McChrystal Group, located around the corner here in Old Town Alexandria. And so at the conference so far, we've been thinking and talking a lot about talent acquisition and recruiting and selection, and obviously we want to be able to select and recruit for leaders. And so what Jeff and I are going to speak about today is, what does leadership actually mean, and what do leaders look like? Our founder, Stan, a few years ago wrote a best-selling book called Team of Teams, and since then we've written another book called Leaders, Myth, and Reality, and Jeff is a co-author on this book. The book itself explores the paradoxes of leadership and how the way we think about leadership today is really sort of a myth. One example of this is humility. Who here thinks that humility is an important part of being a leader? Show of hands. Well, you're right. So the research and science says that humility correlates with effective leadership.
I used to do a lot of undergraduate teaching of leadership before I ran this institute. And one of the most recurring questions when I gave the course on humility and leadership was this one. Some smart undergraduate would usually say, I get it, I got it. But if humility is so good for leadership, how do you explain that guy? How do you explain that one of America's most successful organizations was led by somebody not known for their humility, was known for their arrogance? How do you explain that the vast majority of senior leaders are narcissists if humility is so good for leadership? And those of us who study leadership, particularly those of us that work in a leadership institute, owe you an explanation for these types of paradoxes. Let me give you another one. This is a history quiz. Who was Winston Churchill talking about here? One of the noblest Americans who ever lived. Anybody have a guess? Our history whizzes in the room? I'll give you another hint, the second hint. FDR was talking about the same person. We recognize him as one of our greatest American Christians and one of our greatest American gentlemen. Who were Churchill and FDR talking about? So, if you were thinking Ulysses Grant, anybody thinking Ulysses Grant? That'd be a good guess, because Grant won the Civil War and went on to be an American president. But it wasn't Grant. You'd be wrong. It was actually the guy in the foreground of the painting, Lee, Robert E. Lee, the guy who lost the Civil War and the guy who betrayed his country in defense of slavery. And yet it was Lee, not Grant, that historians for generations held up as a great leader. How and why does that happen? How and why do we get it so wrong? And as Leah mentioned, that's why we wrote a book, to try and explore what we call the mythology of leadership. And the book opens with Washington crossing the Delaware, one of America's most recognizable paintings. And I'm going to confess to you that while I know a little bit about leadership, I know nothing about American history, and I know nothing about art, but I know almost everything there is to know about this one painting. Only because I used to sit on that couch right underneath the painting. I used to be a staffer in President Obama's White House. I worked there for 5 years. And the meetings never ran on schedule, so I'd always be sitting on that couch in the West Wing lobby waiting for the meetings to start. And while I was sitting on that couch, the tour guides would come through, one after the other, talking about the painting that was sitting over my head, Washington crossing the Delaware. So I heard the spiel about this painting 100 times. So I learned almost everything there is to know about Washington crossing the Delaware. And here it is. Take a look at Washington and tell me, just say it out loud, the first word that comes to mind. What do you have? What comes to mind when you see Washington? Leadership, bold. What else? Presence. Thank you. Now, what I learned about this painting, all those hours hearing the tour guides talk about it, was that it's a historical fiction. It's totally wrong. The Delaware River never froze that way. It's the wrong flag for that period in history. The boat's going the wrong way. And worse, it wasn't a 10-foot whaling boat. It was actually a 60-foot flat-bottom barge. So we did some digging, and we found the more accurate depiction of Washington across the Delaware. Here it is. Sure enough, it's a 60-foot flat-bottom barge. But look at Washington again. What do you see? What's Washington doing with his right hand? What's his right hand doing? He's holding on to the wheel of a cannon. And why would he be holding on to the wheel of a cannon? Yeah, because that's what real people do in a boat at night in war. They don't do this. Why not? Because it's ridiculous. But nobody ever says ridiculous. And that's natural. Because we tend to walk around with an exaggerated expectation of our leaders. We inflate our expectations of our leaders. And by the way, our leaders want us to do that. They like it that we do that. So it's a self-reinforcing vicious cycle. But it's a myth. None of our leaders is that good. And this is the mythology of leadership.
In the Institute at the McChrystal Group is similar to the way we talk about leadership today is where medicine was when we were still doing lobotomies. So if you do a Google search for leadership, this is what comes up, which is a representation of what we see as leadership, right? And this one, for example, looks like an individual leading a string of kindergartners and is not actually representative of how leaders lead teams today. It's not how it actually works.
So what we wanted to do was reframe leadership. And in writing the book, we did over 100 interviews. And almost all of them started with, how do you define leadership? And this was the best representation of the answer people gave us. That it's a process that starts with a leader and it's driven towards some kind of results, right? That's what most people told us in those 120-some interviews we did. And I want to share with you one vignette of one of the 120-some interviews, and that was with President Obama, because I worked for him. I had the opportunity to talk to him afterward about nothing but leadership. And all the interviews started with, how do you define leadership? What did you learn about leadership? But in this case, I asked him about a particular trip we took together when I was on his staff. About a week after the raid on bin Laden, we traveled down to meet with the team that did the raid. And the president went down to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, gave the team some awards, got the debrief, and then we flew home that night. And on the way home, I asked him, what did you think about the debrief? I was just trying to make small talk, really. I wasn't trying to be deep or serious, but he was. And I expected him to say something about the operation itself. But instead, his answer was about leadership. And what he said was, I was really struck by the way the team leader did the debrief. And what he was referring to is the fact that when they turned over the floor to the team leader to do the debrief, the team leader said simply, Mr. President, my team will now debrief you. And that was it. Why would that be surprising? Yeah, who does that? Like, it's an opportunity of a lifetime. Who doesn't own it for like 30 seconds? And it's an example of what Leah was talking about, humility in leadership. Or, as many of you know, the technical term is servant leadership. Leaders who believe in the success of their teams. Leaders who believe in celebrating their teams. Leaders who believe that the answers and the knowledge is with the teams, not with them. Very powerful. Also, unfortunately, very rare. But also very misunderstood. Because if you catch up with that team leader, which I've had the opportunity to do over the years, and you ask them, hey, President was really struck with your leadership style. Where'd you get that leadership style? What do you think he says? I went to the McChrystal Group Leadership Institute. He actually doesn't say that. I wish he would, but he doesn't. What he says is, how else are you going to lead a team like that? What choice do you have? So through these examples in these interviews, what we learned is that this definition and this way of thinking about leadership is wrong. Leadership is not a process driven by a leader. Leadership is a system. And you only really have leadership when you respect the fact that the followers have as much to do with the leadership as the leader does. But more importantly, that leadership can't be separated from its context. You never have leadership until you have somebody being responsive to the context. This is how we define leadership. And at our institute, what we do is we try to explore the practical implications. In fact, Leah and I spoke at the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists recently on exactly that question. What are the practical implications of this reframing? And we don't have time today in this short time slot to share with you all of those, but I'll leave you with one, and it's the simplest, which is this. You change your mindset. Leadership is not being the grand chess master, even though that's most of how our leaders think of it. You get a strategy, you know how the game's played, you anticipate your opponent's move, you control pieces, not leadership. The better metaphor is this one, because gardeners don't make plants grow all them by themselves. All the gardener does is cultivate the ecosystem where those plants can thrive and be responsive to their needs, whether it's water, sunlight, what have you. That's one of the many implications we explore at our institute.
Thank you very much. Jeff and I will be here throughout the end of the event, so please feel free to come say hi and let us know if you have any questions or thoughts on the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.